Shinano, a super battleship turned overgrown support carrier, is a fun what if sort of question. The obvious answer to the question, of course, is that she wasn't worth the effort. The Japanese were running out of planes and pilots by the time Shinano was sent to the bottom. Even if you assume she managed to avoid sinking, avoid being bombed, and finish construction, well, she would have been finished right about the time that American and British aircraft carriers made bombing Japan a national pastime. So, the answer to this question is obvious, but that doesn't mean we can't ask about it anyway. However, this will be a short video, especially in comparison to the last few. With that in mind, let's get into it. Shinano, the third of Japan's super battleships, was a ship that never saw the famous 18-inch guns of her sister ships. Intended to complete in 1945 or so, the Japanese decided to more or less suspend her construction in early 1942. They would finish her to the point of clearing her dock, but nothing else. Then the Battle of Midway wiped out a good chunk of Japan's aircraft carrier force. Faced with a sudden need for all the carriers to restore their numbers, the Japanese took another look at Shinano. Now, obviously, they could have made her a fleet carrier. However, the Japanese had a solid core of aircraft carriers left, plus others under construction. So instead of a proper conversion, they made a different decision. What I jokingly call HMS Unicorn after eating too many Wagyu steaks. While not entirely accurate, as they didn't have identical roles, it does serve to demonstrate the point. Shinano would not be a proper fleet carrier. Instead, she would be a grossly oversized support carrier. Her massive bulk was intended to carry reserve aircraft, fuel, and other supplies for the frontline ships, as well as the repair facilities to support their aircraft. The ability to carry an organic air wing was, honestly, a secondary concern. Nonetheless, Shinano was designed to carry aircraft of her own and to be capable of supporting them, with the result that she could carry 42 aircraft for her own air wing, at least as designed. 18 fighters, 18 dive bombers, and 6 reconnaissance aircraft. This is actually not a bad air wing if you compare her to British armored carriers. Until, that is, you remember an Illustrious is around 28,000 tons at full load and carried a similar amount of aircraft. And HMS Unicorn, the most direct comparison in role, carried 33 to 36 aircraft on 20,000 tons. This is relevant because Shinano displaced a whopping 70,000 or so tons, while also being around 200 feet longer at 872 feet, 265 meters, to Unicorn's 640 feet, or 195 meters. Even Illustrious was about 100 feet shorter at 740 feet. This difference in size becomes more apparent in that Shinano was intended to carry something like 120 replacement aircraft in storage. In fact, most of her hangar space was dedicated to that. I'm not going to say she could operate over 100 aircraft had her internal spaces been set up for it, but an air wing at least equivalent to other IJN fleet carriers does seem likely. However, that's not really relevant for the moment. For now, let's imagine that Shinano was not sunk by USS Archerfish and was fully completed. How useful would she actually have been? Well, there's two scenarios here. The more or less like reality scenario, where Japan has decisively lost the war, and an alternate scenario where Shinano is entering service to support a resurgent Japanese navy. For the more realistic option, I think the answer is fairly obvious. By the time Shinano could have potentially been completed, it would have been late 1945. And that's assuming no delays, or that construction wasn't halted on her, like the much smaller conversion of the heavy cruiser Ibuki. In the event that all the stars aligned and Shinano was completed, the ship would have entered a war where Japan was at the point of you can count active aircraft carriers on one hand. The ships she was intended to support were all on the bottom or damaged in harbor, with no planes or pilots. In a similar vein, the island bastions she was meant to resupply were long gone or isolated well behind what passed for a front line. Shinano would, at that point, have been a very big, very expensive target. She couldn't have carried anything resembling her full stock of planes. Honestly, the best thing for her would have been carrying kamikazes, a role she was ill-suited for. As such, in this roughly like our world option, Shinano would have been of questionable utility. She probably would have been sunk at some point, and even if she survived the war, she'd go to the scrapyard, like the other surviving Japanese aircraft carriers. Although she would have been one hell of a sight when American occupation forces arrived. She was an utterly massive ship, in every meaning of the word, for the time. That said, let's look at the alternate option, where the Japanese actually completed their planned aircraft carrier force, and, for whatever reason, they could still operate them with well-trained and experienced pilots. In this timeline, created by alien bats with too much time on their hands, Shinano was able to do her designed role. She sails around supporting smaller ships by carrying spare aircraft and acting as a repair and resupply shop for the other ships, along with carrying planes to land bases as an equally oversized aircraft ferry. All things being equal, she probably does this job fairly well. While there were certainly flaws in her design, I'm not aware of anything that would have made Shinano particularly bad at her role. Though that's difficult to say, with her never being completed and the general state of Japanese records at the end of the war. Regardless, in a perfect world for Shinano, she likely serves as, well, like I said, a massive take on HMS Unicorn, hanging about on secondary missions to use her organic air wing while supporting the other fleet carriers when necessary. With her armored flight deck and massive capacity, Shinano would, in theory, have been a very tough target that could support an operation for a long time. All of that being said, though, does that mean she's worth it in that world? Well, that's an interesting question. She would have been worth it in the sense that, if you're already building a massive ship, might as well get some use out of it. Her air wing is nothing to write home about, especially for her size. But she is more useful in this guise than as a third super battleship. That is not a ringing endorsement, by the way. In our world, it's absolutely not an argument. The resources in steel and manpower spent on Shinano, the time put towards finishing her, those were absolutely a waste and would have been even if she had been completed and not sunk before crossing the finish line. It is worth noting, of course, that it's not quite as simple as cut her up and use the steel elsewhere. It costs money and time to cut up a ship, just like it does to build one. And things like the armor plate can't just be pulled off and slapped on another ship. On the other hand, all of the other steel and the other materials like copper very much could, not to mention the power plant and other equipment. This isn't even touching on the manpower hours. It is very easy to imagine freeing up those men and materials, leading to completing other smaller ships. It wouldn't be a magic bullet by any stretch of the imagination, but that's not the point. The point is that Shinano was a giant drain on Japanese resources that ended up amounting to nothing, and would have been nothing even if she had been completed. As for the world where she was actually useful, well, I would still argue she's a bit of a wasteful expenditure. Just think about it for a moment. Even if she would have been useful in her role, that's still a 70,000-ton support carrier. I struggle to imagine her performing well enough to justify that, compared to scrapping her and using the materials for other ships. The plain fact of the matter is, no matter how useful she could have been, Shinano was just plain too big. While I can see an argument for her being effective, I'm not sure it counteracts the expensive nature of her construction. But, she's a pretty ship, and it would have been quite a sight to see her in dock or sailing around, so at least there's that. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.